Good coffee, good coffee. Good morning, everyone. Welcome back to Morning Musings. My name is Don K. Preston. I'm the president of Preterist Research Institute of Ardmore, Oklahoma. Happy Wednesday morning to you, and here we go. We're looking at Matthew chapter 24 and verse 30, in which Jesus, in describing his coming, at the climax of, pardon me, the abomination of desolation and the great tribulation. He said immediately after the tribulation of those days, the sun will be dark and the moon will not give its light, etc., etc., and all the tribes of the earth shall mourn. This is a direct citation of Zechariah chapter 12, verse 10, the context of which is Zechariah 12 through 14. And as I pointed out to you, if that prophecy is not fulfilled, then the entirety of the Old Covenant, the law of Moses, remains valid and binding today. And that means that Old Covenant Israel after the flesh, remains God's covenant people today. Which, by the way, raises an interesting point, doesn't it? You know, we're constantly told, well, you can't have two laws in effect at the same time. You can't have two covenants in effect at the same time. And yet people turn right around and they say Zechariah chapter 12 through 14 is not fulfilled. Well, those were Old Covenant promises made to Old Covenant Israel. Therefore, if they're not fulfilled, then God's covenant with Israel remains valid. Oh, then they turn around and go to Romans chapter 11, 25 to 27, and they say, Romans 11, 25 to 27 hasn't been fulfilled yet. Christ hasn't come to save all Israel. Oh, wait a minute. That coming of the Lord would be in fulfillment of God's covenant. This is my covenant with them when I take away their sin. So on the one hand, they tell us that God's old covenant, pardon me, with Old Covenant Israel, i.e. the law of Moses, was removed at the cross. Then they turn right around and they say God's covenant with Israel remains valid until the second coming. Now you want to talk about massive, massive self-contradiction. They tell us the law of Moses was nailed to the cross, and then they appeal to a passage from Isaiah 27, Isaiah 59, Jeremiah 31, that predicted the fulfillment of God's covenant promises to Old Covenant Israel at the coming of the Lord. And they say, well, that hasn't happened yet. Then, unequivocally, that means that God's covenant with Israel after the flesh, remains valid until Romans 11, 25 to 27 is fulfilled. I'm sorry, folks, you can't have the covenant passing away at the cross and yet have the covenant remaining valid until the future, so-called future end of time coming of the Lord at, in fulfillment of God's covenant with Israel. Sorry, doesn't work. Okay, well, I shared with you yesterday, Revelation chapter 1. Behold, he comes with a cloud. Every eye shall see him, and all even those who pierced him, and they shall mourn because of him. And I pointed out to you, Revelation 1, 1 to 3, very clearly says, these things must shortly come to pass. The time is at hand. Oh, by the way, I do have to take note of this. We're told that this shortly come to pass. All in the world that really means, and see, this gets down to the point of people doing their dead level best to destroy the time statements. They cannot allow the time statements to stand. They literally scoff at them. They literally ridicule them. Just think about that. Hundreds of Bible verses that former preterists now just literally wave their hand at. They mock and they ridicule those who honor God's word. And they scoff, ridicule, and mock the word itself that says these things must shortly come to pass. And they tell us, well, what shortly come to pass means, it doesn't tell us when it would be fulfilled. It just tells us, pardon me, that when God finally, who knows when, but when God finally gets around to fulfilling them, then fulfillment would take place rapidly. Well, it doesn't say these things must take place rapidly versus imminently. And by the way, the Greek term here, entakai, never, listen to me very carefully. The Greek term entakai, pardon me, never indicates rapidity of action as opposed to imminence of action. I have read commentators trying to make that distinction. It just simply means when it happens, it'll happen rapidly. It doesn't work. And that means that John was being told by the Father who sent the Son to tell him these things must shortly come to pass. The Father, who knew the day and the hour, by the way, was revealing to John time for fulfillment had arrived. But he says, notice verse 7, behold, he is coming with the clouds. Please do yourself a favor. Go back and look at my videos in which I go to the Old Testament passages over and over and over again of God coming on the clouds of heaven. This language of coming on the clouds of heaven is taken from the Psalms. The chariot, the clouds are his chariots. He rides upon the clouds and upon the winds. That's the way God's actions in history are described, as God riding on the clouds. Not literally, not visibly, not bodily, but to say that Christ was coming on the clouds, i.e. Acts chapter 1, was to say Jesus is true deity. That is why in Matthew chapter 24 and 30, then shall the sign of the Son of Man in heaven appear. The language there, the Greek of the text, doesn't mean that some kind of a sign would appear up in the heaven, up in the sky, and they would see something up in the sky and go, oh, well, okay. No. In the events of the abomination of desolation, in the events of the Great Tribulation, in the events of the judgment of Jerusalem, they would see those visible events and know that Jesus was enthroned in the heavens as King of Kings and as Lord of Lords, and was acting in judgment just as his Father had acted in judgment many, many times before. After all, that's what he said he was going to do. The Son of Man will come in the glory of the Father with his angels, and shall reward every man according to his works. That's the judgment coming of Christ on the clouds with the angels in judgment and reward. It's not the ascension. It's not the transfiguration. It's not Jesus' resurrection. It's the time of judgment. And thus this language, behold, he is coming with the clouds, is an iteration of the deity of Christ. Only God rode on the clouds, according to the Tanakh. For Jesus to say, or for John to be told by the Father, that his Son was coming on the clouds, was an affirmation of the deity of Jesus. Well, we haven't got to the rest of the text this morning, have we? But boy, this is important. This is so incredibly important. People want to depreciate the place, the identity, the definition of Jesus. Well, guess what? He is King of Kings, and he is Lord of Lords. Well, tomorrow we will continue our examination of Revelation 1:7, and we will look at the language. Every eye shall see him, all the tribes of the earth shall mourn because of him. Even those who pierced him. You don't want to miss it. So I'll see you on the flip side.